right, who's putting a speech in the mouths of the Egyptians, right? And so whatever else it means, I think there is, and I'm guessing John or Don maybe talked about this, but one of the major themes of Exodus becomes God certainly showing himself as the protector and keeper and creator of his people, but also as the creator and God over all. So imagine you get a job, you think it's going to be great, or maybe not, you just need to pay your bills. You get in there, and you sign a contract, and you sign a lease, and there you are, and it turns out it is awful. And your boss is awful, and you're working 1 million hours, and it's like the worst work experience you can ever imagine. And then you meet this other guy who runs a company, and it's your dream job. And you're like, and there's just like this spirit about this person, and you connect personally, and you're like, this is where I want to work. But you're under contractual obligation, right? You're in a lease, you've got bills to pay, right? You're like, there's no way. There's just no way. So what if that, for the boss you really want to work for, ends up offering to buy out your contract, right? And then you're like, and you're right, like, and be like, I'll take care of it. Like, yes, right? And I think often that's how we think about what's happening in Exodus. I think what's actually happening is that the second boss, or the first boss, the awful boss, is actually, his company is owned by the boss who really want to work for. So he doesn't have to buy him out, right? He's like, I already own, surprise, I own this company, and that guy is mismanaging, right? He finds out that like he's not doing what he's supposed to do, right? And that he wasn't supposed to be treating his employees horribly. He wasn't supposed to be overworking you and not encouraging being awful, right? Not giving health benefits and discriminating against women and all those things, right? So that's essentially what's happening in Exodus, right? It's that what is God's claim to judgment? Because we see, and we're about to talk about, how salvation in Exodus goes hand in hand with judgment. We love the salvation part. We're like, yes, right? And right behind it, there are 2 miracles in Exodus 14, right? What are they? Kind of the 2 big ones. Yeah.
Open the sea, closed.
There they are, right? There, thank you. Appreciate it. Right? That there's a miracle of salvation and there's a miracle of judgment, right? That results in judgment. And salvation for Israel still, because the people who are coming after them, right, get judged. But we love the opening. You know, I want to lean. I mean, I was even praying this morning. Like, I want to lean so hard on the salvation part, right? And less hard on the judgment part. And they're both there. Just like there are passages, and maybe John talked about this, I'm not sure about the hardening stuff. In some of those passages, the tense in Hebrew is essentially circles it back. So it says, like, Pharaoh hardened his own heart, right? Or essentially, like, the hardness of Pharaoh's heart was confirmed by God, but it was like, it's clear that he's the agent, right? There are others where it's the opposite, where it's clear that God has his, like, is hardening exactly as we read it, right? And then there are places, I mean, we get even in 14, right? It's in some of our translations that ESV does in verse 5, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants were changed. In Hebrew, it's the same word as heart. So it's like, his heart's hardened, so you could read that as like, what I think is true, which is it's a combo, right? That there is not just in Pharaoh's instance, but in the world, a complexity of factors that we find it very difficult to understand, right? That God is at work, and people are also free agents in some considerable way. God is sovereign over that, but it doesn't absolve responsibility, right? We never get this picture in Scripture of like, well, God just is like, there's no sense of puppetry, right? That instead, there's very much this sense of what I think we get. We kind of want the good guy. I want the good guys to be so clearly good and the bad guys to be so clearly bad. And we get sad when it feels like these bad guys that are getting like crushed under the water are not clearly bad. The interesting part is the good guys are not clearly good either, right? Like Israel's a mess all the time. They're constantly a mess, right? And we feel that in our own lives. And so the mercy of God, that the emphasis ends up instead being on God asserting what is absolutely his sovereign right to assert, and that his mercy is the thing we are meant to marvel at, right? That the reality is that the saving action of God is miraculous, right? But also that I'm always struck by my Westernness in reading oracles of judgment, because I'm reminded of how protected I am, right? That we live in a world where a lot of people do understand very much what it's like to be in fear for their lives and to have enemies that are out to harm them, right? And we're talking about a group of people who have been oppressed. The early in Exodus, it says basically they had broken spirits, right? If you try to get a bunch of people with broken spirits to, essentially like leave the only place they've ever known, they've never traveled, right? These people have no idea what's outside, right? And Moses is trying to corral 600,000 men, right? This is like a logistical nightmare, plus like everyone has PTSD, right? Like fathom that. It's like you're taking a country like Sudan, right? And trying to get a bunch of oppressed people and be like, all right, we're all moving, we're going, right? It is wild, right? To just kind of start to inhabit what I think maybe is so different from most of our experiences. And I don't think that solves everything, but I think this narrative, we're meant to kind of, and I love hearing like snatches of your conversation, because what I heard was you guys tried to imagine what it would be like to be Israel, and I think that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing in this passage, is to be living into the richness of the narrative. What else? Anything we haven't covered, or kind of bigger? Of course there's a lot of things we haven't covered, but things you've noticed or jumped out at you guys?
Notice the contrast between the Lord, like this, in verse 14 it says, the Lord will fight for you, you have only to keep still, versus in verse 24, the Egyptians being thrown into a panic. And I think that contrast between stillness and panic, because I was mostly talking about okay, he says to be still, but he also gives, somebody else pointed out, a lot of directions, a lot of direct commands. So whatever being still means, clearly does not mean do nothing.
Yes.
Correct. But evidently it is contrasted with being in panic. So that's one thing it doesn't mean.
It's good. I love that. What else?
One thing that we kind of talked about and thought was interesting was thinking about the passages just before this, when God was bringing all the plagues onto Egypt and doing these miracles to allow them to escape. And then they get to the Red Sea and they still doubt God, even though he's been showing them his power for months. We just related it to our own lives, where God has done so much for us in our own lives, and yet at times of need we still doubt his ability to do it again. So just a place where we can really identify with the Israelites and see how flawed they are and how faithful God is.
How do we understand that? Maybe John or Don talk through some of this, but how do you guys think about, as you're reading Israel's story, do you think about, if I'm a Christian, that's also kind of my story, does it feel very far away? How do you make sense of that? How do we make sense of that?
What do you mean?
Meaning, how do you understand the relationship between Israel, Old Testament Israel, and the New Testament church, right?
I do frequently feel like I imagine myself into certain parts of Old Testament Israel's story, but it's clear to me that there are certain parts that I come back to over and over again. It's whenever I'm freaking out, I feel, and I come back and I read Israel sitting on the banks of the Red Sea right before God started to part it. That's how I feel. I don't very often feel like Israel is still in Egypt, like oppressed.
Yes.
So there are like certain parts of the story that I just don't get, like I don't feel. But yeah, I think in a lot of times, like even if the text doesn't like, I can't empathize with it exactly. I can empathize with the emotions.
For me, I think it's like a continuum. Like this is our heritage. Like this is essentially like our family history and like what we have to look back to. But then we also have, you know, the redemption. Like here was Jesus, and he like made a new covenant, and like now he dwells in us, and now we don't have a need for a tabernacle. We don't have a need for a priest and all these sacrifices. Like we can just go directly to God. But then it's like for me, it's like almost like a warning, because we can't be very much like the Israelites. You know, we do complain a lot, and we're like, I don't know, God, I don't know if you're really caring, or if you're in this or not, or whatever. And then I think it's more like a warning, like look back at your history and just know that I am God, and I am great, and I have it all figured out. You know, but I also know you're linen, and I also know you're kind, because we turn back in the pages and it's like, oh, yep, we did it, you know, all the way through the end. Actually, we still do it now. So it's just, for me, it's just like a continuum. And it's just knowing like that's our family history.
Yeah, Olivia.
I think a couple of things. One, in this, and just reading through Exodus, the reminder of God's investment or sovereignty versus our input. Like, God has a plan, and I know that it's like an over-Christianized phrase, but like, he really, like, we're talking about how detailed this is. And it wasn't like the Israelites, it always came from the top down. And I think that that's in some ways really freeing for us, that we can often get caught into knots worrying about our role in the redemption story. And we have to always remember that it's God first doing the like 99% of the actions. And then the other thing that I find hard to like grapple with and rationalize is like, there's so many times when God's like, no, you're going to do this, and the Egyptians are going to, like, it doesn't, on the surface, it takes a long time before it looks like what God ended up happening. Yes. So I can think of so many times when you go, oh no, like, I did this wrong, or God's answer is no, or God's answer is different, but really, that's his choice all along. And that is very strange. And I'm still grappling with the whole, like, you know, you're going to sit by the riverbank, and then you're confused, and my glory is going to be great because of that. Like, I don't really see the logical steps in that. Like, I see my glory is going to be great when I like drown out the Egyptians. Okay, you see that that's a mighty force of God. But like other specific details seem strange or unnecessary or like why?
Yeah, and I think that's so honest, Olivia, and I think helpful to remind us again of the sovereignty piece, and again of the just like unexpectedness of redemption. Right? We're talking about the paradigmatic redemption of Israel is the crossing of the Red Sea. The paradigmatic redemption of God's people now is the cross, right? Jesus' death and resurrection. And so we look at the narrative of the cross that we're given, and we're like, that is why that and that. And I mean, we're talking about a bunch of good Jewish boys who are all like hanging out with him, who not only don't get what's happening, but are like actively unhelpful, you know, in the whole process. And I think redemption so rarely, and by rarely I mean never, looks like we think it's going to look, right? That there is a foolishness to it, right? And there's certainly a foolishness, it seems, to Israel's story. All right, 14, speaking of which, 14:10, we get kind of this amazing, just like honest moment, as the people of Israel cry out to Moses, right? Typical, and we'll hear this again. Is it because there weren't any graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us and bring us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. 5 times in that passage, Egypt gets mentioned. Right? Never does Yahweh get mentioned. Right? No, like, notice that. I was reading a commentary and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I didn't even pick up on that. And yet it is so clear that because we know in our own hearts often that when we're in that moment of like needing rescue, that we so clearly see the threat, or think we do, we're obsessed with the threat, and not like, it is not natural, right, for us, certainly not without the Spirit of God in us, to turn and look at Yahweh, right? Because although the manner of redemption is often surprising, the means of redemption, the one who redeems never changes, right? And so we see this invitation to trust. Julian of Norwich is this mystic. She's amazing. She talks about God. I love this language. She says, God is meant to be seen, sought, expected, and trusted. And then a modern theologian adds, and enjoyed, which I love, right? Seen, sought, expected. Right? I don't know how, but I know he's coming, right? Expected, trusted, and enjoyed. Right? And so we get Moses saying, fear not, which fear not is like the announcement that salvation is coming in scripture all the time, right? Christmas story, fear not, angels start turning out, fear not, God's about to do something, fear not. It's like God's walk-up song, if you're a baseball fan, right? It's like, fear not, like, get ready, God's gonna do something amazing, stand firm, right? And that there's just such an emphasis on the initiative of God and the helplessness of the people, right? This is just, odds are stacked against them in every single possible way, right? God does this miraculous work, and he does a miraculous work in creation. So, did John talk about, or Don, when he was talking about the plagues, kind of the nature of God's judgment, how kind of what that tells us about? Anybody remember that? So, I'll just reverse it because a lot of you aren't here. So one of the amazing things about the plague is here we're talking about people who you're not like, hey Tyler, I know you've been a slave in Egypt for the last 50 years, but here's a Bible, which doesn't exist at the point, right? And like God, he's God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And you're like, I am sweaty and dirty and super tired, right? God makes himself known in this like in through creation, right? He starts doing things where like, okay, like there are gnats everywhere. The water of the Nile has been turned to blood. Like, that's difficult to ignore in some real life. Tyler's like, stand still because you're in the camera.
That'd be fine.
Right, but there's an undeniability and also an assertion of sovereignty, right? And so we see in the Red Sea similarly this sense of like God does this crazy, active, obvious work that no one can deny. And in doing so, he's asserting himself not just as the God who rescues his own people, but as the God who commands all of creation because he created it. Hence, the kind of obsession with Egypt knowing. Now, how Egypt knows, I'm guessing word just got back to them, right? Maybe, who knows, if something escaped, right? But somehow, word begins to get out about this God of Israel, right? And that he triumphs over humanity, right? Triumphs over the scary forces of Egypt. He triumphs over creation, where he controls the nature, right? And he triumphs over other gods, right? That whatever your national God is, because it was super common in a way that we actually probably really understand today, to say like, hey, we as a nation have our God, and you as a nation have your God, and everybody's got their own God who sort of controls the place where they live, right? And so, in the same way, there was this sense of like, okay, like you can have your God and I can have my God, and it's sort of like the precursor to pluralism, right? Like kind of on a broader scale, and we understand that, right? And so God's saying, like, I'm not just Israel's God who sort of like takes care of Israel, but I'm the God over all of creation. Does that make sense? Any thoughts or responses?
Something I wonder about
Yeah.
that I never noticed until right now or like today. So you wonder about, it seems like the Egyptians, yes, die. Too bad, that sucks for them. But they recognize the Lord for who he is first, which like, you can ask for something better than that, like we're gonna die. At least know who God is first,
Yeah, I also have a question about that specifically. If they were all wiped out.
Yeah, that's what they're asking over here. Unclear.
Who recorded thoughts?
Right. The third person. Unclear. I got nothing. We could all speculate, right? That somehow word got back. And yeah, I don't know. Lizzie.
Is there room though to hope? Yeah, because I noticed that too, but I was curious. But it's also not like they, I don't know, maybe this would have been too much text, but it's not like they bow down and start worshiping God, right? And they're like, oh my gosh, we know you. Their instinct is to like run away. I mean, and maybe you can say like, okay, well they're running from Israel and like the waves, not necessarily God. And like there's this recognition that like, wow, like this is actually the one true God. But yeah, I don't know. Is it? I guess it's like we're making guesses about you.
No, but I think that's a really important question, Lizzie. That actually takes. That's not an Old Testament question, right? That's a question of like, okay, what? And I think it goes back actually to the judgment question. So in Romans, let's kind of walk back to the heart of the piece. Remember the Romans passage? If any of you read Romans, if you've studied it a year or so ago, when we did it. Do you remember us talking about hardening in Romans? And there's this long passage, right? Romans 9 through 11. It's kind of like famously one of the most difficult passages to grapple with. And Paul is talking about how Israel's hardened, so the Gentiles can come in, right? Basically, like, hey, God's people were Israel, but then Israel, most of Israel just do not receive Jesus as the God of Israel, right? And as their means of salvation. And so Paul writes this entire book to defend God, essentially, and saying, God made all these promises to Israel. Is God actually just? Is he who he says he is? Right? Paul says, actually, he is. It was offered to Israel. But now, it's been offered to the Gentiles because Israel has really rejected Jesus, right? Well, one of the ways we talk about that is that hardening is not a permanent category, right? So we think of hardening like, well, you're screwed, like damnation, sort of in like the old school, like Puritan sense. And I think a better, Paul is saying like hardened for a season, hardened for a time, right? And then he actually uses, like, he is writing the entire book of Romans as something of a polemic to make Israel respond to Jesus, right? And so there's this sense of being like, at any point, those who are hardened are being given, those who are being judged, let's like use those two words together for these purposes, are also being given an invitation, right? And we see that when Jesus comes. If you go back and read the gospel, right, you're like, and maybe do it with this in mind. Jesus comes and lines start being drawn. And granted, they are unexpected lines, right? And we love to talk about that. Like, Jesus loves the prostitutes. Jesus loves the sinners. People are coming to him. But then the religious people are not, right? And they are not responding. They're really upset often, right? And these lines are being drawn in weird places, but they're still lines. Right? And judgment is happening, right, essentially. That there are, people are in or out. And I think sometimes we think, like, if people could just see Jesus, then they would say yes, right? Like, if that person just encountered Jesus, it would be a yes, right? And I think actually what we see is because of the costliness of saying yes to Yahweh, because of the submission that he's asking for, right, that there's a very real decision, which I think actually affirms and confirms human agency rather than denies it. Which is to say, it is possible to come face to face with God and say no. Anybody read The Great Divorce recently? C.S. Lewis. I think that's such a great book for that because it's such a bizarre story. If you read it, it's wonderful. It's like British fiction is so delightful. And he's, the Brits, man. Also, their children's literature is scary. I grew up on it and I love it, but it's also like children should not be reading it. Everyone is orphaned and tortured. It's very dark. Made me have a dark spot in my heart, which is, but, I mean, there's this, in The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis is talking about hell, and it's the idea that these people who live in hell take a bus trip to heaven, okay? If you haven't read it, read it. We've got 1 billion copies in the HCFA office. You can have one. It's all yours. And that you kind of like, you're rooting for people to like reroute, right? And C.S. Lewis, in his introduction to that book, says, and I wish I had the exact quote, but he basically says, it's not that those who have gone wrong can never go right, but they can't go right except by going back to where things went wrong and getting it right. What he's saying is you can't just redefine right. You can't just decide that this road is the same as that road. He's saying you can be on the wrong road, but at some point, if you want to be on the right road, you've got it. Like that transition has to actually happen. You got to get off one road and onto another, right? There are people in Egypt who willingly get off one road and get off another, right? I think the assumption is that probably there are a number of Egyptians who, I mean, we see at different points, right? The hail's coming, and there are people who take their livestock in and people who don't, right? It's like there are people who are like, oh yeah, definitely this is coming, right? And so we see those dividing lines start to happen, and I think that continues throughout Scripture, is that there are, and I think what that should make us do is not go, well, what are you going to do? Some people say yes, some people say no, but to say, like, God is so unbelievably persistent, so as not to write people off. And he is ridiculously kind, right? In that, like, we get this passage in Isaiah of the end time, and he says, and then, like, Egypt is coming, and Cush, and he starts to name those who are in the kingdom, right? And Egypt is at the top of the list, right? It's that, like, these nations who have been formerly, like, not just enemies of God, but like the primary enemy of the people of God, right, are going to be in the kingdom, right? Which is a reminder that it's not about ethnicity, right? It's about God making himself known, and then people responding to God making himself known. And we are not the people who, if you're a Christian, right, you're not the people who decide, you're the people who make God known, right? Like, God is pulling a people out to image bear, right? For the sake of, not instead of, right? Does that make sense? It's a lot. That's like a big flyover theology right there. Questions, thoughts? But I do think it's important for us to see that continuity with Jesus, right? That Jesus is not this like, well, God in the Old Testament, nice. But Jesus, so nice, right? And instead to see God always like mercy and judgment, right? At the cross, also here, right? And then we get this really cool passage in Exodus 15 that is one of my favorite of all time. If you are a worship leader, this is one, like arguably, most people think it's one of the oldest things we have in Scripture. Because turn to Exodus 15. So what probably happened is Miriam, who is Moses' sister, right? Aaron, Moses, Miriam. Miriam is like the worship leader for Israel. And so up till this point, what we have in Genesis and the first half of Exodus is narrative. It's like, here's the story, right? And then Miriam sings to Israel in verse 21, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. And that song gets expounded on. It's the longer kind of version in chapter 15. And we don't have time to hang out there. I really wish that we did. But let me take us to 13. So if you're there's actually Starfield, I think, did a version of Exodus 15, a song called Who Is Like You? And just put a lot of the words of scripture straight to music. I think it's beautiful. But again, we get this redemption for the sake of belonging and being in the same presence. I think one of the craziest parts of Exodus 15 is the part where the cloud comes between Israel and Egypt. And the sense is like it's light on one side and dark on the other, right? That there is very much, I think, again, we get that picture of the same presence, right? That is a theophany. It's a picture of God's presence dwelling with his people, right? And it's the same idea that Israel, the people of God, experience it as redemption and protection. And the enemies of God and his people, right, experience it as darkness and judgment. Same presence, right? So here we get the end goal again of presence. In verse 13, you have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed, right? So all of a sudden, the narrative and the promise have become this like personal worship song. They become like poetry, right? It's, hey, here's the story, and then here's our heart response, right, to the story. The people whom you have redeemed, you have guided them by your strength to your holy abode, your dwelling place, or the place where you dwell. And then in 16, till your people pass by, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. Again, redemption language, right? You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, right? You are bringing your people into a place where they no longer have to serve Pharaoh, but they're serving Yahweh. So we get, and I wanted to talk about Passover, but we're not going to have time. But just the institution of Passover in 13, we get 3 things instituted regularly. What are the 3 feasts in 13? Everybody, you can look. I mean, I'm not expecting you to go around. What gets instituted on the reg for Israel? Anna? So she gets the reading.
Consecration of the firstborn.
Absolutely. Consecration of the firstborn, which is really interesting. What else?
Feast of unleavened bread.
Yes. Don't let the yeast grow. What else? The obvious one. Passover. Totally. Right? So we get these 3 feasts that get incorporated into, and here's how they get incorporated in. The beginning of that passage in 1240. We get this language of summary statement of kind of where Israel's been. They've been there for 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord, of Yahweh, went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by Yahweh to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to Yahweh for all the people of Israel throughout their generations. Does anyone have a different translation that says something other than watching?
Which was this, sorry?
In 1242.
This was the night of vigil for the Lord.
Vigil.
When he brought them out of the land of Egypt. So on this night, all Israelites must keep vigil for the Lord.
I mean, it's kind of a strange concept, right? It's like God was like watching Israel intently, watching over them intently, right? During this time, especially, right? And therefore Israel responds by not just remembering, right? And telling, but goes on to say, by practicing, by participating, right? By doing a lot of things, reenacting. It's like, hey, you can't eat Passover in your own house without your shoes on. Like, you gotta be ready to go, even though you're in the land at this point, right? There's an establishment of, we move from narrative, right? Here's what's been happening in the history of Israel, past tense, here's what happened, we're retelling it, to here's what you're gonna do, like institution of cultural holidays, essentially, right? So there's a sense of like, hey, because of your story, here's what you're gonna do when you're established. So it's kind of like if, when you graduated, you're like, you know what I'm gonna do every year? Come back to my reunion, in my cap and gown, right? And like, do all the things I did for graduation. And in doing so, I'm gonna remember, like, what God did for me here, what my season was like here. I'm gonna like, but I'm doing it with all my friends, right? Like imagine something like that, where there's just this, like, first of all, you keep in a lot better touch with all your friends, because you'd be like every year, right? I'm actually like, that's not a bad idea, right? But there's this like rehearsal and that like gets in your bones. My family, you guys have like family traditions of trading. My family has this like story that we read every Christmas. And it started seriously with like a level of seriousness, and then it got to be like ridiculous. It's like an old story, and we make my dad read it, and it's like my brother got married, but like until she was like they were engaged, she didn't hear the story. Then I was engaged, and then now it's like okay, you can hear the story, but it's like important, you know, but like kind of funny because right, but it every Christmas Eve, we're like a grown adults, like laying there listening to my dad read the story and like show us the pictures. And you're like, it's kind of funny, but it's kind of like, no, we're doing this. Like, and like, you better not laugh. Like, you can laugh a little, but you can't laugh like too much. It's so serious, right? But there's this sense of like incorporation and belonging that happens when we access tradition, right? And it's like those stories become a part of us, right? And we rehearse them and we remember. And how much more so if we do it kind of with an attention and attentiveness to detail. And so one of the ways that happens is redemption gets practiced in Israel, because every time anybody has a baby, whether woman or animal, right? That firstborn requires an offering, right? So either the firstborn is offered if it's an animal, right? Or if it's like a donkey, you can give a lamb in exchange for the donkey, right? There are all of these kind of rituals surrounding it. And what is that? Like, why would God require that? Well, one of the thoughts is that at the time there was, if you were paying rent to someone, you essentially gave them the first fruits as like your payment of rent, right? And I mean, that's essentially the picture we get, is that it's not like God is like, hey, where's mine, you know, because that's what you owe me. It's actually an indicator of God's ownership of everything, right? It's a reorientation of a people who have watched their sons and daughters go to make bricks for an oppressive, awful regime and never get paid, right? And never experience the benefits of true humanness, right? Imagine that mom who just was like devastated. You can imagine sending your child, right, to work. There was a lot of work in brick making that is specifically for children, right? For child labor is awful, right, and messy. And so these people are watching their children take this on. And God is saying, hey, I've taken you out of that. I've rescued you. I've redeemed you. And now, like, when you have, like, offspring, as a reminder that, like, all the earth is mine and I've set you free, and now you belong fully to me, and that actually means freedom and not bondage, you're going to, like, enact this ritual that is actually a ritual of thanksgiving, right? And of gratitude, of saying back to God, like, everything I have is from you, particularly freedom, right? My ability to enjoy the fullness of creation, right? And so we get these built into the life of Israel, these rituals that are remind them, right, of who owns everything. And I think we see something similar in the institution. I mean, we talk all day. I think one of the most important things to start thinking about in your 20s is what kind of rituals you are going to have with the Lord. Because you can begin to establish things in community. I would encourage you to get a community of people that practices memory together, right? That learn how to remember well what God has done for you. And as a people, we remember, if you're Christian, we remember and reenact, right, what Christ has done. When we celebrate baptism, right? When we watch others baptized, when we take the Lord's Supper, take Eucharist, take communion, right? We're replaying and in doing so participating again in the story that makes us, that forms us, that's our identity. And so, and we are no less, I know it can be hard to kind of read this and go, yeah, but I was never in bondage, and Lindsay kind of mentioned that. And I think to think about, even now kind of where those areas are, if you are not a Christian, no doubt you feel bondage to things. If you are a Christian, it's still very likely you feel enslaved. Maybe fear not is like, yep, that is not, right? I need a pronouncement of God's salvation that starts with fear not. Right? That I am real busy looking at Egypt and not looking at Yahweh, right? That redemption has already happened for you in Christ and you've been remade in your identity because of that. Or if that's never happened, it can. We'd love to talk to you about it. But that story is our story, and that's what Jesus does, right? That the story of the crossing of the Red Sea is the story of the cross and the resurrection, and then the presence of God in us in the Spirit. That's kind of the end game of Exodus. So, yeah, that's all I got. There's so much more, guys. I didn't even get to manna, but here's what I will say. Read the next couple chapters, and the story of manna is one of my favorites. And what I will say is God goes from being their Redeemer in these glamorous moments to saying, I'm also your daily sustainer and provider. And that is, on one hand, the redemption is so critical, but many of us live in the daily sustaining and providing, right? And so I'm so grateful for that. And literally, they call manna, the literal translation of manna is, what is it? And they look at this thing and they're like, what is it? Right? And that is just so helpful, I think, for us to say, sometimes we look at God's provision and we're like, what is that? Right? That is not what I was looking for, actually. Right? And we are reminded again that He is, that really, like, it's through relationship with Him, and there is no shortcut. So, can I pray for us?